Imagine that before your eyes there is a stained glass window that no one else can see. It's not made of physical glass, but of invisible layers built up over time. Memories, beliefs, emotions, rushed conclusions. Everything that passes through it, the brightness of the streets, someone's expression, the heat or cold in the air, reaches you already tinted by these internal colors. This stained glass isn't just an aesthetic detail of perception. It is the very frame through which you define reality. If its color is clear and translucent, the world seems open. If it's heavy and opaque, even a sunny day can feel as dense as an endless winter. What's curious is that most of the time, we believe we're seeing what's out there when, in fact, we're seeing what the glass allows through. Now imagine that the world you see today is not exactly the world as it is, but a filtered reflection through this stained glass. This means that any real change in perception doesn't begin with adjusting the external scene, but with altering the internal filter. It's like discovering that the backdrop of all your experiences is painted from the inside out, not the other way around. The most surprising detail is that this glass does not renew itself. It responds almost immediately to the way you observe, interpret, and give meaning to things. Each time you confirm a recurring thought, people are cold, life is hard, opportunities are rare. It's like reinforcing a layer of paint that, little by little, covers the entire surface. Likewise, when a new angle of observation appears, even for a second, the entire tone of the glass can change. And this change, though invisible to others, transforms everything. Because it's not the world that must adapt first. It's your focus that, once it shifts, reconfigures the scene you perceive as reality. And this isn't an abstract idea. The way the brain, energy, and even fields of possibility work respond directly to this silent lens. What we're going to explore today is how this internal shift is the true lever of transformation, how the colors of the glass are adjusted not by chance, but by the conscious or unconscious choice of the observer that you are. And most importantly, how realizing that nothing, absolutely nothing out there, moves in any meaningful way until something in here changes first. It may be uncomfortable to admit that much of what you experience isn't an objective reflection of the world, but an echo of your own way of seeing it. But it's also liberating because it means you don't need to wait for external circumstances to align for the experience to shift. The key lies in the quality of the light that passes through the stained glass, and that light is born from how you choose to look. Today, we're going to walk through this idea in a precise and profound way, from the scientific basis that explains why certain stimuli take center stage in your awareness, to the physics that shows even the void is active, through metaphors and practices that reveal how small internal adjustments can reshape the whole. It's not about creating an illusory world, but about realizing that the scene is more plastic and malleable than you've been led to believe. Because the very moment the inner glass changes color, the entire world changes tone. Not by magic, but by coherence. The outside can't sustain what the inside no longer projects. And when you understand that, you realize that the transformation you were seeking out there had all along been waiting for your first internal move. Inside your brain, there's a silent yet decisive network that functions like an internal radar. It's called the salience network. Salience because its role is to select, among billions of stimuli arriving every second, which ones are relevant enough to become conscious reality. It determines whether the distant sound of an engine enters your field of perception or gets ignored, whether a detail in someone's face becomes significant or passes unnoticed. This radar doesn't just register information, it interprets. It filters not only based on intensity, but also on what it considers meaningful to you according to patterns built up over your lifetime. That's why two people can be in the same place and experience completely different realities. The world doesn't change between them, but the radar selecting what each person sees is unique. The problem, and also the solution, is that the salience network can get stuck in old scripts. If at some point you internalize the belief that the world is threatening, this radar will prioritize signals that confirm that perception. Small gestures will be read as hostile, neutral expressions will seem cold, neutral situations will take on unnecessary weight. The brain, thinking it's protecting you, keeps your focus locked on these cues, reinforcing the same narrative. That's why even when external circumstances change, the internal experience sometimes stays the same. You can move to a new city, switch jobs, or change your social circle. But if your radar remains tuned to the same signals, it will feel like nothing has really changed. The setting may be different, but the soundtrack chosen by your internal system is still the same. The good news is that this radar is not fixed. Studies show that the salience network is highly plastic. In other words, it can be trained to recognize and prioritize different stimuli. This isn't about forcing an artificially optimistic view, but about teaching the brain to regard new information as relevant. It's like changing the soundtrack of a movie. The scene is identical, but the emotion it conveys changes completely. This adjustment starts with the awareness that the current selection is not an absolute truth, but a conditioned pattern. When you realize that your attention is not registered neutrally, but guided by a pre-programmed filter, the possibility opens up to redirect it. It's as if suddenly you realize the control panel is accessible, and you don't have to accept that the radar keeps spinning on the same axis. The practice of deliberately shifting your focus, whether through observation exercises, meditation, or simple habit changes, directly impacts this system. By including new elements in your perception, you signal to the salience network that other cues are worth tracking. Over time, the old pattern loses strength, and the radar starts operating with a new priority. A simple example: walking down the same street every day but by choice, observing only the textures on the facades. At first, this will take conscious effort because the radar will try to bring back the usual stimuli: noise, people, signs. But with repetition, something shifts. The radar begins to automatically include those textures as part of the relevant field. The effect? The experience of the street changes, even though nothing on the street itself has. This is the point where neuroscience and the idea of the inner glass meet. The salience network is, biologically speaking, one of the closest mechanisms to that invisible stained glass. Adjusting it is adjusting the lens. When it changes, the world you perceive changes. Not because the setting has physically shifted, but because the selection of stimuli has been redesigned. Realizing this gives you back a degree of freedom we often forget we have. It means you don't need to wait for the external environment to prove it's changed in order to experience something new. You just have to teach your radar to look for different cues, and your inner landscape will begin to reorganize. When you understand that conscious reality is only a small filtered sample of total reality, the idea that nothing changes out there until something changes in here stops being philosophical and becomes literal. And it is this radar, discreet but decisive, that holds the key to the first move. At first glance, the vacuum seems like an absolutely empty space, a void where there are no particles, sound, or light. But quantum physics dismantles that image with one startling detail. Even in so-called nothingness, there is activity. What we call a vacuum is, in truth, a vibrant field, full of fluctuations that appear and disappear at unimaginably small scales. The Casimir effect is one of the most elegant demonstrations of this truth. When two extremely close conductive surfaces are placed face to face, something unexpected happens. Even with no apparent force acting between them, the plates begin to attract each other. This force doesn't come from visible particles or any direct physical contact. It arises from the difference in quantum fluctuations between the space inside and outside the plates. In other words, even the silence between them holds enough energy to create movement. This image is more than just a curious physical phenomenon. It's a living metaphor for what happens inside us. Just like in the quantum vacuum, we too carry internal regions of silence, spaces of non-action, where nothing seems to be happening. These are the moments with no clear answers, no strong impulses, no visible changes. But just like the Casimir effect, these spaces are not truly empty. They are full of latent potential, waiting for a small shift in attention so that subtle forces can begin to act. It's not brute force that activates them, but the invisible tension created when two poles of perception, two internal plates, draw closer in a new configuration. When your focus remains fixed on one interpretation of reality, it's as if those internal plates are positioned to always sustain the same kind of interaction. The space between them vibrates at the same pattern, so the outcome is predictable. But when the way you observe changes, whether by interrupting a repetitive thought or opening to an unusual perspective, the distance between those plates shifts. And with it, the field of possibilities changes too. Quantum physics suggests that what we call reality isn't static, but a field of probabilities that collapses into specific forms based on interaction and observation. Translated to the human level, the observation you maintain isn't neutral. It selects which versions of experience manifest. If your observation is rigid, the results tend to repeat. If it's flexible and conscious, new combinations of reality become possible. The Casimir effect reminds us that we don't need to create from scratch to generate movement. Often what's missing isn't force but repositioning, adjusting how two internal parts relate so that the latent energy in the silence can express itself. That's why meditative practices, moments of pause or simple shifts in focus have disproportionate power over experience. They reposition the internal plates, altering the pattern of the void that connects them. This void isn't the absence of life, it's the cradle of all manifestation. Ignoring it is like living only on the surface of things, reacting to what's already been shaped. Accessing it is returning to the place where the world is still malleable, where the next moment hasn't yet been decided. It's in this space that true change begins, not as an immediate visible impact, but as a silent reorganization that will inevitably become evident. If we think back to the invisible stained glass from the introduction, the Casimir effect is like the light that passes through the colors before reaching your eyes. That light comes from a field where everything is possible, but it only reveals itself according to the form you choose to offer it. Changing the color of the glass is, in practice, repositioning the plates of attention until a new kind of energy emerges. And here lies the crucial point. Just as the plates in the experiment don't choose to attract each other consciously, the external world doesn't rearrange itself on its own to offer you a new experience. The movement begins when the internal field shifts, when the silence between your perceptions is repositioned. The effect is inevitable. New forces arise, new paths open, new realities become tangible. What seems empty is, in fact, the most fertile space there is. And your access to it doesn't lie in changing the outside world, but in changing how your own internal plates come together. When that happens, even silence begins to push you toward a new state of reality. Imagine a suspended garden floating in the middle of the sky, high above the predictable seasons and cycles of the earth. It doesn't depend on rain or external sunlight. Its life is sustained by a secret well hidden at its center, far from any casual gaze. This well is the only source of water capable of nourishing the invisible roots of the plants growing there. However, the quality of that water is not constant. When it's murky, filled with accumulated residue, the flowers silently wither. Even if the horizon is bright and gentle, winds circulate through the garden, the petals lose their luster, the leaves shrink, and the green turns pale. Nothing from the outside can restore the lost vitality, because the source is compromised. But when the water is pure, clear as crystal, something almost magical happens. Even on an overcast day with heavy clouds hanging over the sky, the garden blooms exuberantly. The colors intensify, the fragrance spreads, and even the air feels lighter. There was no direct external intervention, only a change in the essence of what nourishes the place. This garden is your experience of reality. The well is your inner observation. The water is the quality of the attention you offer the world. Everything that happens out there is filtered through this silent process of nourishment. If the water is full of worn-out beliefs, automatic judgments, and narrow interpretations, the landscape of your life tends to lose its freshness, even under favorable conditions. On the other hand, when the water is clean, as when attention is renewed and becomes clearer, more open, vitality spreads to every corner, regardless of external circumstances. The most important point here is understanding that the state of the garden is not explained by the weather, but by the source. This challenges the common narrative that, when things get better out there, I'll feel better in here. That reversal is the core of many spiritual traditions, and at the same time echoes the scientific discoveries we've seen in the previous parts. It is not the external setting that regulates your experience, but the quality of the internal lens and energy interpreting it. This metaphor also reveals something about the responsibility and power you carry. Taking care of the garden isn't about chasing every wilted leaf or trying to control every gust of wind. It's about returning to the well and checking the water. This means investigating how you are looking, with what emotions you're watering the situations, and in what ways your internal stories are coloring what you see. In practice, this water is made of the silent attention that precedes any judgment. It's that fraction of a second before labeling something as good or bad, right or wrong. It's in that instant that the color of the water is defined. Attention filled with fear tends to project scenarios where even neutral gestures seem threatening. Attention filled with curiosity opens space for the unexpected to be received as discovery, not as risk. What's most curious is that the suspended garden doesn't need applause or witnesses to flourish. It exists in the silent heights of the sky, where almost no one looks. In the same way, many internal changes do not announce themselves with fanfare, but produce deep effects. Invisible at first, then impossible to ignore. It is a silent but cumulative work. And here comes the direct connection to the central idea of this narrative. The visible world is only a reflection of the state of the invisible well. External conditions may change, but if the source is not transformed, the pattern will repeat. On the other hand, when the water changes, the entire garden responds and even the wind seems to cooperate. This image of the suspended garden is a reminder that the reality you live is not so distant from what you cultivate internally, and that the deepest care you can offer the outside always begins with the silent adjustment you make inside. Because no matter how high or isolated your garden may seem, it will always be nourished by the quality of the water you choose to offer. It is said there once was a man known for his skill in drawing maps. He dedicated days and nights to tracing routes, recording mountains, rivers, and cities he had never seen. Everything he knew came from travelers' accounts and images he had stored in his mind since youth. His room was small, but the walls were covered in yellowed sheets and meticulous lines. To him, the world was a collection of lines, curves, and names. Year after year, the cartographer refined his maps. He corrected contours, added details, replaced old names with new ones, but he never crossed the threshold of the door. His maps were not based on direct experience, but on inherited versions of what the world supposedly was. One day, something changed. It wasn't a grand event, but a quiet unease that began to set in. Holding his pen over the paper, he realized he couldn't tell whether the line he was about to draw was true or just another assumption. The doubt, once avoided, now felt inevitable. Driven by this strangeness, he stood up and opened the window. The air entered with a scent he didn't recognize. The sound that came from outside didn't match any label he had written on his maps. Looking toward the horizon, he saw land curves that didn't correspond to the ones he had drawn. He noticed a river flowing in the opposite direction from what he had always believed. The colors, the light, even the sense of distance were different. The world hadn't changed at that moment, but his perception had. For the first time, the internal image that guided his work didn't match what his eyes were seeing. It was as if a thin film separating the outside from the inside had become visible, and he understood that all those years he had lived more in the maps than in the territory. This story symbolically echoes within each of us. Many times we walk through life using maps we did not consciously draw, but inherited from past experiences, from others' voices, from old interpretations that remain intact. These maps are not just representations of the world, they shape how we interact with it. The pattern breaks when, for some reason, we decide to open the window and allow the real territory to make direct contact with our perception. That's when we realize the difference between what we think we see and what is truly before us. And just as it happened with the cartographer, this realization doesn't require the external world to change, but for the internal observer to allow an encounter without intermediaries. In neuroscience and psychology, this opening is comparable to a radical update of the internal models we use to predict and interpret reality. When new information clearly contradicts our usual expectations, the brain needs to recalibrate. It's a process that can be uncomfortable because it demands letting go of the safety of a known map, even if it no longer accurately represents the territory. Yet it's within this discomfort that true transformation lives. Every time you allow yourself to observe something without the overlays of the past, the inner stained glass changes color. The salience network, which we spoke about earlier, repositions its radar, and what once went unnoticed gains presence. It's as if the world suddenly becomes sharper, wider, more unpredictable. The cartographer, after opening the window, didn't abandon his maps immediately, but now they were built from a new foundation, direct experience. He knew that if he went back to relying only on the old versions, he risked losing sight of the real territory. In the same way, when you open yourself to seeing with freshness, even for just moments, you begin to realize that many of your internal maps are not entirely false, but they are outdated. And updating this material doesn't require rebuilding everything at once. It's enough to create moments in which the territory is allowed to show itself as it is, without the automatic interference of what once was. This is the essence of breaking the pattern. It's not about denying the maps, but recognizing that they are not the world. It's about opening the window and allowing the breeze to shift a few of the lines you once believed were unchangeable. Because the moment that happens, it's not the world that changes. It's your way of inhabiting it that will never be the same. There comes a moment when the mind becomes convinced that certain emotions, beliefs, or reactions are direct consequences of the external world. It's as if it says, what you feel came from out there and reached you. This impression is so strong that we rarely question its origin. It is precisely here that the seed inversion technique acts, shifting the point of creation from the external to the internal. The proposal is simple in form, but profound in its effects. To choose a specific emotion or belief, something that seems to be imposed by the situation, and imagine it not as a fruit that came from the world, but as a seed that has always been in the inner soil, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. Start by finding a quiet space where you can remain for a few minutes without interruption. Gently close your eyes and bring to mind an emotion you attribute to something happening outside yourself. It might be anxiety that seems to stem from a work deadline, sadness associated with someone's gesture, or anger triggered by recent words. There's no need to relive the scene. Just acknowledge the emotion itself. Now, instead of imagining it as something that came from outside to inside, visualize this emotion as rooted in the center of your body, like a small dormant seed. Realize that the external stimulus only touched the soil where it was planted, and the reaction emerged because the seed was already there. This change in perspective shifts the axis of control. You stop being the field where everything is planted by external forces and become the gardener who decides what grows. Then imagine yourself watering this seed with a different kind of attention. Not the rushed attention of someone trying to pull it out, nor the indifference of someone who abandons it. It is a slow, silent attention, like someone pressing their ear to the earth to listen to the sound of growth. Breathe into this state, allowing presence to be the nutrient. While holding this visualization, notice whether anything in the quality of the emotion begins to transform. Maybe the mental color changes, maybe its symbolic shape or texture shifts. The seed might begin to dissolve or open in an unexpected way. The point is not to force a specific result, but to observe what happens when the relationship with the emotion shifts from automatic reaction to conscious cultivation. This inversion is powerful because it removes from the external world the role of dictating your internal state. If the emotion is born from within, it is from within that transformation first occurs. This is the moment where neuroscience and contemplative practice meet. By changing the type of attention given to an emotional content, you activate different brain circuits, disarming the automatic pattern and creating space for new connections. Hesychasm, a contemplative practice from Eastern Christian traditions, spoke of bringing the mind down into the heart to observe emotions from within. The seed inversion echoes this idea, but translates it into a simple and direct gesture. Instead of waiting for something external to put out the fire, you sit beside the fire and change the way you observe it, until it responds to this new presence. When you open your eyes again after a few minutes, you'll notice the world around you is the same. Objects are in the same place, people remain in the same positions, and sounds maintain the same rhythm. But something essential will have changed: the way you find yourself in front of that scene. The inner stained glass will have shifted its tone, and with that, the way the scene is experienced will no longer be the same. This technique does not require you to be a meditation expert or to have a lot of time available. It is portable, silent, and invisible to those around you. It can be done during a break between tasks, in a crowded room, or in the quiet of a bedroom. What it does require is only the willingness to accept that the seed is in your hands, and that by changing the way you care for it, you will inevitably change the garden it nourishes. Nothing out there truly moves until something in here changes position. The world is not a fixed painting, but a faithful echo of the lens through which you observe it. Change the lens, and the echo changes. Adjust the stained glass, and the light that passes through the whole scene transforms, even if the shapes remain the same. It's not illusion, nor a trick of perspective. It's coherence. The outer world responds to the design that the inner world sustains. That's why, before trying to fix the scene, look at the color of the light that passes through it. This is the place where all change begins. Today, you have the choice to change the world by the way you see it. And if you've made it this far, write in the comments, "The stained glass has changed. I want to know you walked with me until the very last moment."